All right, my name is Megan Purdue. I am the Ag Agent in Worcester County, Maryland for the University of Maryland Extension. This is Goat911 version 2.0. We're going to be talking about the #1 killer of sheep and goats in just a second. All right, as always, we do have a little disclaimer. The advice in this presentation does not represent medical or veterinarian or legal advice. Always seek a competent veterinarian for advice when possible. If we use a website, a brand, a product, that's not an endorsement, that's just what's available here in our local area. And it is essential to have a veterinarian in the event of an emergency. This session will cover the Barber Pole Worm and parasites a little bit in general. It is applicable to sheep, goats, alpacas, even to a certain degree, any grazing livestock, because some of the stuff we're going to talk about in there is universal to grazing livestock, and it's also very helpful. But we'll be specifically talking about FAMACHA and how we deal with parasites in small ruminants. So first, we're going to talk about a little bit of a history lesson because it's important to understand how long it takes for a product to be developed and how quickly resistance happens with these products. So the first dewormers were developed in the 1940s. In the 1950s, you might see a familiar product, piperazine, especially if you deal with poultry. Then in the 60s, something a little bit even more familiar to those of us who have been raising small ruminants for a while is the benzimidazole. So albendazole, fenbendazole, like the Valbazen, Safeguard type products, the white dewormers. Pyrantel came along in the mid-70s. So you might be familiar with that if you have, if you deworm your own dogs or you deal with horses. And then the macrolytic lactones came on in the 80s, ivermectin and moxidectin, that group. Ivermectin was used probably pretty much exclusively in the late 80s and early 90s. I remember my family only using ivermectin. I still see farmers today, especially cattle farmers, who still only use ivermectin and have been using only ivermectin for 40 years. So there is a lot of resistance to that because it was used so much. But it's important to also know that anthelmintic resistance was first documented in the 60s. So the first dewormers were developed in the 40s. 20 years later, there was already anthelmintic resistance. And then we look at, it's been a long time since we've had new dewormers developed in the US. So we do have resistance. All right, so what is the enemy? The Mungus contortus, the barber pole worm, that's the primary worm of importance for those who raise small ruminants, especially if you're in an area like I am, the mid-Atlantic, or even the whole East Coast. You get down into like Georgia, places where it's humid, it's warm and humid. It's a big problem. It's a parasite that lives in the abomasum and it sucks blood from the host. Sheep and goats are highly susceptible. Alpacas are also highly susceptible. However, you can do stuff. Alpacas should be a little bit easier to keep clean and manage the manure because they do poop in piles. That is one advantage to alpacas. So if you only had alpacas, your management could help you out quite a bit with keeping this under control and having to deworm less. If there is a significant infection, it can kill the host, and it does kill the host quite frequently. That is probably one of the big things that I see when people have a sick animal, especially with social media and people posting stuff on social media. A lot of times it is a barber pole worm infection that their animal's suffering from. At a minimum, it causes a loss of productivity because it causes the animal to be anemic. It also causes protein loss, so the animal tends to lose weight. This parasite thrives in warm and moist environments. So the area that I'm in, it's warm enough most of the year. We have maybe a couple weeks where it's too cold for it. We might have a week or so in the summer where it's too hot for it, but for the most part, it can survive most of the year in my area. So we're talking about Maryland, the mid-Atlantic. It's the most deadly parasite in many regions of the US. So if there's moisture and it's warm, it's going to be thriving in that environment. So a little bit about the biology of the barber pole worm. It is a gastrointestinal roundworm. It is red and white striped. That's why it's called the barber pole, because it looks like an old-fashioned barber pole. The red is actually ingested blood. The white is the eggs in the uterus. That's why it has those red and white stripes. The adults can be seen with the naked eye. You're usually going to have a very severe infection and a big worm kill to see that. I've seen it once. It was a goat that we had dewormed, and she was actually in the vet's office for a blood transfusion, and it looked like long strands of very, very fine hair in her feces. She survived it with the blood transfusion. She was a tough little goat, but yeah, it was a massive infection for her. The barber pole worm has a small tooth on it that scratches the abomasum and then sucks about a drop of blood each day. Where this becomes a problem is when you have thousands of these in the gut of an animal. And each female can lay more than 5,000 eggs per day. That's how you get these massive amounts of them so easily. It has a 21-day life cycle. And the ideal environment for the infective larva is 70 to 80 degrees with about 2 inches of rain per month. So here's the life cycle of it. You may have seen this diagram before. It's quite popular. But the adult worms, they reside in the abomasum of a small ruminant. After about 14 days, the females start laying eggs. The eggs are passed in the feces. If the environmental conditions are right, the eggs will hatch. That's an important part, if the environmental conditions are right, because these worms have the ability to basically shut down so that they don't use up their energy and die off. The larva will develop in the L1, L2, and L3. It gets to that L3 about 3 to 4 days after hatching, again, depending on the weather conditions. Those L3 larvae are the problematic larvae. That's the infective larva, but they can survive for months on pasture if they're not ingested. And this is something that we've learned more recently, because we used to say like 3 months your pasture without animals on it, your pasture would be clean. Now we're looking at more like over a year. The L3, the way they cause problems is they migrate up a blade of grass, and then the animal goes and bites that blade of grass off with the larva on it. The larvae then get into the animal, and then they continue development into the L4 stage, and then into adults in the abomasum again if those environmental conditions are met. That L3 can go dormant if the environmental conditions are not favorable. So if it's too cold, it's too hot and dry, they do have that ability to go dormant. So how do we recognize an infection? So the symptoms of a heavy parasite load, one is bottle jaw. That's edema. That's where you'll get the fluid buildup under the chin of the animal. This goat in this picture has a very serious case of it. He did survive. The people who were tending him thought that he had been hit in the face. And that's why it swelled up. So that's why they didn't contact me right away to get him treated. By the time they get bottle jaw, they are considered critical. So if an animal shows up with bottle jaw, they need to be treated immediately. You need to keep a close eye on it. Anemia is the primary symptom, and that's where the mucous membranes are pale. They're not pink anymore. They can get light pink or white. Animals are usually going to be lethargic earlier on before you see some of these other symptoms. So that might present as just not being as active, not keeping up with the rest of the flock. If you have an animal that's not friendly and you can walk up to it and it's laying down and it doesn't jump up right away, that might be a reason to get a hold of that animal and check it for a barber pole worm infection. Weight loss can be one of the first things that you may or may not notice, but usually the animals with a barber pole worm infection will lose weight. They can get a rough hair coat. They'll have reduced production. So if you are milking your goats and you notice that their milk production has dropped off, it could be because it got too hot on them. They're not eating as much, but a barber pole worm infection would probably be something that you would want to rule out. A lot of people consider diarrhea as a symptom, but it's not truly a symptom of a barber pole worm infection. What usually happens is they will get another parasite at the same time as the barber pole worm that does cause diarrhea. And then death is a symptom of it as well. So there is a 5-point check system that if you take a FAMACHA training, they should go over this with you. But these are the things that we want to look at when we're evaluating animals. So we're not missing other parasite infections because the FAMACHA system helps you determine if there's a barber pole worm infection, but there are other parasites that might need to be treated as well. So the first part of that is going to be the eye, and for the eye, we check the FAMACHA score. Another area that we check is the back, and we talk about the back because we're checking the body condition score of the animal. So if the animal has dropped weight, there's probably a reason for it, and we need to address that. The tail is another area for those parasites that cause diarrhea. The coat for goats, we want to check the coat and see what the coat condition is like. And then the jaw, we're checking for bottle jaw. If you have sheep, because they have fleece and not hair, except for hair sheep, replace the coat with a nose check. You're checking for a discharge. We're looking for bots. So the FAMACHA system is an in-field test to estimate the pack cell volume of goats and sheep. So when we talk about pack cell volume, you see it abbreviated as PCV. That's a measure of anemia. So if you took an animal to the vet, they would do this by drawing a blood sample, spinning that blood sample down into a little tiny tube, and then comparing it to a chart, seeing how many red blood cells there are against the total volume of blood that's in that tube. This system was developed in South Africa, and it trained producers to compare the color of the lower eyelid to the colors on the FAMACHA card. It's designed to allow producers to determine which animals need treatment right then and there, rather than pulling a blood sample and having to spin it down to check. So this is the FAMACHA card. The way you see that presented now is that's an old picture. Now we do the cover, push, pull, pop. Years ago, when we first started using this in the US, we would just pull down that lower eyelid to check the color. And if you can do nothing else, because it is sometimes hard to handle the animals, at least get that, you want to at least pull down that lower eyelid. We're looking for the inside of the lower eyelid. All right, so how do we kill it? All right, so this is important because this has changed it. The treatment we recommend has changed a little bit over the past few years because resistance developed so quickly. But one thing that hasn't changed is the whole purpose of the FAMACHA system is to only treat the animals that need treatment. So if you treat animals that don't need to be treated, that contributes to faster resistance to that dewormer. And we do not want to do that because we only have a few dewormers that we can even use. We don't need to develop resistance to all of them. So animals with a FAMACHA score of 4 or 5, they're going to be pale pink or white, will need to be treated. And then an animal with a FAMACHA score of 3. So if we look back at the card, there's a question mark over the 3. So that question mark is because they're borderline, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to treat that animal. We need to look at the other parts of the 5-point check. So if they're a FAMACHA score of 3 and they fail other points on that 5-point check, we're going to deworm them. But if they're a FAMACHA score of 3 and they pass the 5-point check, then we're probably not going to deworm them unless there's other factors there. And they go through this extensively with FAMACHA training. I would recommend if you have a FAMACHA score of 3, you do not treat it. You need to go back and check that animal more regularly and make sure that either they score better the next time or they don't get any worse and you do need to treat them. All right, so we hear a lot about fecal egg counts. So what about the fecal egg counts? Can you use a fecal egg count? We should not be using fecal egg counts as the only reason for treatment. Fecal egg counts are useful if we combine them with a FAMACHA. They're very useful for making management decisions. So you may have a high contaminator in your herd or flock that you decide to cull because they have high fecal egg counts all the time. Or you may choose to deworm a high contaminator if nobody else is needing to be dewormed to lessen the parasite load on your pastures. But it's not the sole reason that we're going to treat them. It's very useful in determining the effectiveness of anthelmintics. So you can perform yourself a fecal egg count reduction test where you pull a fecal sample from your animals. Then you deworm them after you pull that sample, and then 10 to 14 days later, you go back and you do another fecal sample from those to make sure that the number of eggs has dropped significantly. There's also something called a drench rate test where you can send pooled fecal samples off to be analyzed. That's kind of expensive, but if you're having problems with dewormers and parasites on in your flock, then that would be worth the investment. All right, when you use anthelmintics, you need to make sure that you are using effective anthelmintics. As I've said, there's widespread resistance to every class of dewormer. So there's a lot of people that think their dewormer is working, and I suspect that they just didn't need, their animals just don't need to be dewormed when they're deworming. I run across a lot of people who deworm once a month still. Fortunately, most of the time they're using ivermectin. So there's widespread resistance to ivermectin. So, we have other options if they've developed resistance because they've overused it. But you only want to be make sure you're using effective anthelmintics. And keep in mind, since some of these, especially for goats, are not labeled on the label for these products. If you use a drug in any way other than directed on the label, it is considered off-label use and requires a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. There are only 2 anthelmintics that are approved for use in goats, and those that are approved for use in goats may not be effective. When you use anthelmintics, you want to use at least 2 from 2 different classes. And you want to use the strongest, most potent one from those classes too. This helps slow the development of resistance, and it gives you better results. All of your dewormers for small ruminants should be given orally. You do want to weigh the animals and have a good idea of how much they weigh. You don't want to be underdosing your animals. You want to give the proper dose. So make sure that you are getting sometimes the label is not correct, especially for certain species. So you want to make sure you are giving the proper dose. And we'll talk about where to find that. Both drugs, ideally you would give 3 different ones, 1 from each class. But each one should be given one right after the other, but you cannot mix them in the same syringe. Mixing drugs together in the same syringe can do bad things to the drug. So you don't want to do that if they're not compatible, and you're not a chemist, so you don't need to be mixing the stuff. But you want to give them separate syringes. I have different color syringes for each drug that I use, so that I make sure that I'm not mixing it in any way in a syringe. Dewormers need to be given in the back of the throat, over the back of the tongue. Ideally, you need to use a drenching syringe for this. Those are those long metal syringes. You can either purchase the whole syringe with everything, or you can purchase just the metal piece that you can pop that onto a regular disposable syringe. But those do pull apart. I have used that one before. It does pull apart. So you have animals, if you're deworming a lot of animals, it's not likely to stay together for you. All right, so these are the charts with the doses on them. These come from wormx.info. These are actually old charts. They have updated them since I put this presentation together. I think in the last year or so, they've updated them. I kind of missed this chart because the sheep had the green column in it. So because I own sheep and goats, I want to make sure I don't get them mixed up. So it was easier to make sure that I had the correct chart because of that green column, and they don't have that anymore. But these are the different, they have all of you can go just by the weight of your animal. I will caution you for prohibit if you are mixing it, and make sure if you are using this chart that you mix it according to the directions on this chart. If you mix it according to the directions on the back of the package, you may have to calculate your own dose. This dose might not be accurate for you. If you are mixing it more concentrated, either for sheep or goats, because I know some people like to mix it super concentrated, so they have to give less of it, this chart is not going to work. So make sure you are giving the correct dose. It does tell you right up at the top. So for example, prohibit for goats is 12 mg per kilogram, or we'll say 12 mg per kilogram. So if you are not mixing it according to the directions down below, then you will need to calculate that out. So there are 3 classes of dewormers off to the side. The benzimidazoles, the white dewormers, include albendazole and fenbendazole. The macrolytic lactones are the avermectins, otherwise known as ivermectin and moxidectin. The nicotinics includes levamisole, marantil, and pyrantel. So if you were trying to decide what system you were going to put in place on your farm, you would ideally choose one dewormer from each of those 3 groups. So either albendazole or fenbendazole, then ivermectin or moxidectin, and then levamisole or Marantal or Pyrantal. The most popular one for a lot of people is going to be Moxidectin and Prohibit. Those are in two separate, Prohibit's under the levamisole. Those are out of two separate classes. But if you want to be even more effective, go ahead and add in one of the white dewormers. But you do need to use caution, especially this time of year with if you are using valbazin or albendazole, because that one does have a pregnancy restriction on it. So you can't use it in the first 30 days of a pregnancy or within 30 days of removing your buck or your ram. So keep that in mind, especially this time of year, if you are using if you're using valbazin. And valbazin tends to be a little bit more potent than Safeguard. All right, so why don't we just go ahead and deworm everyone then? It would be easier to probably just go out there, round everybody up and deworm everybody. Well, one, that does cost more money. And we might be able to save a few bucks by not deworming everybody, but there are very few effective dewormers available. We have to do everything we can to slow the development of resistance. So when we leave some of the animals untreated in a group, we create what's called refugia. That means that the worms that are resistant to the dewormers and not killed will breed with the worms from the untreated animals, so the offspring will remain susceptible to the dewormers. So the animals that were treated, the only worms that are going to survive that treatment are going to be resistant to that treatment. So if we were to deworm everybody, then all the animals would have worms breeding within them that are resistant to that treatment. So they're passing on the eggs. So when we don't treat everybody, then we have a population, we're saving that population of worms that are still susceptible to the treatment. It comes down to breeding with everything, even the worms. So sometimes animals do require supportive care, especially if they have a heavy parasite infestation. If they're extremely anemic, they're going to need some supportive care. So what we want to do is we want to move the animals to a clean environment. So it's an environment where they're not going to get reinfected with more parasites. That might be a stall, that might be a dry lot where there's no grass or weeds growing, so they can't pick up any more worms. But you want to reduce the stress on the animal. Keep in mind they are herd animals, so they might need a friend there with them too. You want to provide nutritious feed, usually a high protein feed. Just be very careful that you don't provide too much of something that they're not used to and give them diarrhea, because diarrhea on an animal that's anemic is not going to be very good for its survival. So, if they've only been on pasture, maybe just a good quality grass hay. When they have a severe case of bottle jaw, it's going to be very hard for them to eat. So even if you're providing them feed, if you're providing them a good grain, they might not be able to eat it very fast. So if they're out there with the rest of the herd, they're going to get outcompeted for feed very easily. It's going to take them a longer time to recover. Probiotics are always a good option in this case. B complex, because their gut might not be functioning exactly like it should. Iron supplements can be a little controversial. Some people say they help. Some people are arguing that they don't. It doesn't hurt usually, but just be very careful, because a lot of them, they may have some of the iron supplements may have other things in it. So you want to be careful if they have copper in it, if you're dealing with sheep, and you don't want to keep them on iron supplements for a long period of time, because iron is an antagonist to a lot of other minerals. So just be careful of that. Vitamin K may be helpful for clotting issues, because again, if you remember, these worms are putting like a little nick in the animal's gut every time they feed. So it might help them clot so they're not bleeding internally. Might help them build back their red blood cells faster. Fluids, whether that be IV fluids, if you have that option, or something orally, make sure they're getting plenty to drink. And then a blood transfusion is also an option. Most vets now that work on small ruminants are able to do that. It does come down to money, if you can afford to put that money into them, but it does help them recover really quickly. And also you may have to provide the donor animal. So that would have to be an animal that is in a stage of production where it's not going to hurt it. That would also have to be a very healthy animal with a very good phalanges for. So the big thing that I want to talk about with this is how do we prevent it? So one, you have to understand who is most at risk. Your lambs and kids are going to be very at risk because they have a developing immune system. They have other stressors going on. You know, even if you have a breed that is like a breed of sheep that is very resistant to it, that resistance has to build up over time with its immunity. It doesn't come out of the womb resistant to those parasites. Our paraparchment females who are near giving birth or have just given birth, they have a decline in immunity around that time, so they can be very vulnerable. Lactating females, especially if they're high production, or females that are raising twins and triplets, they're going to be most at risk. Stressed animals and animals with a low body condition score. So thin animals are going to be more at risk. So it does help to have clean pastures. So I'm going to define a little bit what I mean when I'm talking about clean pastures. These can be a pasture that has never had a sheep or a goat on it, or an alpaca, I should say. Those are going to be considered clean because there's nothing been on them that can shed the barber pole worm. Pastures that have been rested for 6 to 12 months, meaning there's been no small ruminants on them. They may, if there was a large parasite population on them before the animals were pulled off, there may still be some viable larvae in those pastures, depending on the environment, but you know, it should be cleaner than it was when the animals were actively on it. Pastures that have been used for hay production are considered to be clean. And any new pastures that have been used for other crops. So say you have a field that was in a corn and soybean rotation and you decide to plant that in pasture, that's going to be a clean pasture. Healthy pastures also help with keeping parasites under control. So when you're talking about healthy pastures, that means you want to keep your forages over 4 inches in height. That is good for the grass. That is also good for parasite control because that larvae migrate up to about 2 inches, maybe 3 inches up the blade of grass. So if it's over 4 inches, the animals, especially if they're being rotated and they're not allowed, you don't allow them to graze the same spots over and over again, shouldn't be grazing down to the dirt where there's a higher population of that larva there. In order to keep your pastures healthy, you should soil test them to see what nutrients they need, and then put on any liming agents and fertilizer to keep good growth of the grasses. If your pastures get too short, you want to remove the animals so you don't overgraze them. Again, that overgrazing can damage the pastures, but it also can cause them to get a higher worm load. Practicing pasture rotation is an excellent way to help control parasites. That also keeps the grasses healthy. It allows them to rest and can lower the contamination. It also keeps those animals from developing those favorite spots and eating them over and over again. And then you can also rotate with other species, which will help. So speaking of other species, multi-species grazing is another option to help control parasites. Cattle and small ruminants don't share the same type of parasite. So they have a roundworm, but it's not the Homuncus contortus. Same thing with horses. So sheep, goats, and alpacas share the Homuncus contortus, but cattle and horses are not susceptible to it. So if you have cattle and horses out there with your small ruminants, or if you rotate them through, say you put your small ruminants through first, then you let the cattle graze that pasture or horse graze that pasture. The idea behind that is they can help clean the pastures by ingesting the Homuncus contortus infective larva, which is going to be a dead-end host for them. They also have complementary grazing habits to small ruminants, which can help you have a better, more productive pasture. Sanitation is another important aspect. You don't want to feed on the ground. You can use feeders that the animals are less likely to step in, especially if you have goats, because you know even the fence feeders, they like to get their dirty little feet in. Clean dirty feeders and water troughs. If you have bunk feeders, goats like to use those as beds. And wherever they sleep, they're also pooping. Clean out and make sure you clean out any manure prior to feeding. If you have those types of feeders, feed your hay up in hay feeders. That's a more natural way for goats to eat. And it does keep the hay off the ground. But if you are feeding in hay feeders, know that your animals aren't going to show bottle jaw usually as readily, because bottle jaw is where that fluid accumulates in the lowest part of the body, and typically it accumulates under the jaw because the animals are have their head down and grazing for a large part of the day. But if they have their head up and they're eating out of the hay feeder or the browsing, they're not going to tend to get the bottle jaw. Dry lot or zero grazing is another option. It gets a lot of bad press with people because, you know, goats and sheep, they like to be out grazing, but it's not a terrible option. And sometimes if everything else fails, that's going to be your only option. But when I talk about dry lot or zero grazing, I'm talking about areas with zero vegetation. There's nothing green growing in there that the animals can get to. There's no grass, there's no weeds in there. The problem I see when I tell people to put their animal on dry lot, or they tell me their animals on dry lot or in a zero grazing situation, when I go to see it, it's an area with really, really short grass. That's not their pasture. Well, that doesn't work. That's actually can cause more harm than good when that grass is really, really short. So you want an area with nothing growing in it. You can also use this when there's no clean pastures available. So if you have sick animals that need to be in a clean area, it also might be necessary if the animals are recovering from a parasitic infection. This is where you would want to put them, somewhere where there is no grazing. Again, that could be a stall in the barn. Also, you can utilize this when your pastures are not available. If you're renovating your pastures and you can't have the animals grazing on them, or if you've had a dry summer and the pastures aren't growing, or it gets too hot, the pastures aren't growing, you can pull the animals off, allow those pastures a chance to recover, and the grass to get taller and start growing again. And then this is something, if nothing else is working, this is your last option. Especially if your dewormers don't seem to be working. And there's no shame in doing this. This can work well for people. I have seen this on a dairy farm, and it works great because animals don't ever need to be dewormed, so there's no withdrawal period for it. So it's not a terrible option. Forages are the types of forages you use are another important thing in fighting parasites. So any forages high in condensed tannins can help control the barber pole worm. They shouldn't eat pure stands of this 24/7. You're usually going to put this into a pasture rotation situation. Some example, or put it into a mix. So some of these can be put into a mix with other forages. The examples of high condensed tannins are Sericea lespedeza. So that's a very popular one that a lot of people try to get their hands on around here. There's not many options to get this. Sometimes if you live somewhere where there's racehorses, somebody might be growing it for them, but it can be hard to find in certain areas. Chicory is one that you could put into a cool season pasture mix, and bird's foot trefoil is another popular one. Browse is another option because, you know, if you have goats, you know, goats like to browse. Certain breeds of sheep will browse. But the good thing about browse is if they're eating up off the ground, it's too high for the parasitic larva. So they can't ingest that larva. Other ways to battle the barber pole worm: enhanced nutrition. So animals with a good body condition score and receiving better nutrition can handle parasite loads better. If your animal skin over bones and it gets a high parasite load, you're going to have a hard time getting it to recover. You can also get resistant breeds. So for goats, the Kiko is a popular breed that's more resistant to parasites. For sheep, hair sheep are one of the more popular breeds, especially like the Katahdin. But keep in mind that just because the breed itself is resistant doesn't mean that every animal of that breed has inherited that. You can also cull your problem animal. So it's about 20 to 30% of your flock is shedding 70 to 80% of the worms. So if you do fecal egg counts and you locate those 20 to 30%, you could in theory cull them and cut down on your parasite problem. Biosecurity is a good thing to keep in mind, especially when you're purchasing an animal. When you purchase an animal, especially an animal that's been out on pasture, you are also buying its worms. So the problem with this is if they have a terrible management plan for dealing with parasites, it might be resistant to a lot of the dewormers on the market. So it is good to have a conversation with the seller of how often they deworm, what they deworm with. The thing I don't like for somebody to be able to give me an answer easily when I ask them when they deworm their animals. If they say every month, that's a red flag. If you're buying a hair sheep and they say, I can't think of the last time that I dewormed them, and the sheep look good, then that's a good thing. But if they're deworming them regularly and they're deworming everybody, that's a big red flag. You want to quarantine and treat your new animals before you put them out on your pasture or with the rest of the animals. If you can if you're buying bottle babies, that can be a great thing, especially if they've never grazed. If you put them in a clean environment, then you may never have an issue with worms if you can keep it clean. Copper oxide wire particles are another option, another tool in the toolbox to battle barber pole worm. These are actually little wire particles that are put into capsules that you bolus into the animal. What happens is these wire particles, they lodge in the abomasum where they kind of cut up the adult barber pole worms. It is considered a slow release form of copper, so you should use caution on this, especially with sheep. You need to know the copper levels on your farm. That's hard to do because the only way to get this information is to do a biopsy of the liver or the kidneys. That would be quite expensive on livestock. So your next best option is, especially if you have any of your animals butchered, to get the liver back and send that off for an analysis of, especially for the copper. You can get other information from it as well, but you definitely want to get the copper level. You want to use the lowest dose. So these come in 2 grams and 4 grams if they're labeled for sheep and goats. You don't actually need that much. So you could buy your own capsules and repackage them, weigh them and repackage them into an even lower dose. And these are more successful when you use it in combination with a dewormer. But there's a link down there. If you are interested in this, I do encourage you to read the article that's listed down there. That's on wormex.info, so that you fully understand what you're doing before using them. Another option is Livamol with bioworma. This is still fairly new. The information I have on here is from 2020. So the price has probably gone up since then. But this is a fungus that traps and kills nematode larvae. Still a fairly new product in the US with limited retailers, one being the primary one being Premier One Supplies. This is a daily feed additive. So recommend that if you're using this, use it when the temperatures are 40 degrees Fahrenheit and up. It is expensive. It's dosed by animal weight. When I looked up the price of this, it was running $4 per 1,000 pounds of animal each day. That adds up very quickly, and that's a significant feed cost. So that is one of the downfalls to it, but it does work well with all grazing livestock, horses, cattle, everything. So some concluding thoughts to wrap up. Keep in mind that deworming is a treatment, not a preventative. You should never be using deworming as a preventative unless you are dealing with something like the meningeal worm and that you're at high risk for that. And with that, we usually use ivermectin. For most people, ivermectin doesn't work on the barber pole worm. And if you are at that point, you need to have a serious conversation. If the meningeal worm is that much of a problem, make sure that that is what you're dealing with and have a conversation with your veterinarian, because one, you're probably going to be using treatments that are off label. Our goal is not to eliminate parasites, but control them. We want to use management to prevent parasitic infections, not rely on dewormers solely. And my biggest recommendation for especially people just getting started is to start clean and stay clean. So when you purchase animals, if you can purchase, you want to raise dairy goats and you purchase bottle baby kids that have never grazed, those are going to be clean animals. So you want to put them on a pasture that's never had small ruminants on it, and it'll stay clean. Now, where you usually get a parasitic infection coming onto your farm is when you buy that buck because you got a good deal on him, or you loaned a buck and he's going to be an adult, most likely having grazed. He's coming with parasites with him. So when he poops, he's going to be shedding parasites. When you bring new animals onto your farm, if you are buying animals that have grazed, make sure you keep them in a quarantine area and deworm them with one from every class of dewormers. Give that time to work through, keep them there for a couple of weeks before you turn them out onto your permanent pasture. But try to, if you're starting with a property that has never had, especially sheep and goats on it, then try to keep it as clean as possible. Some of the resources, I do recommend that everyone attends a FAMACHA, an integrated parasite management training. We just did one here locally on Friday. That's considered an all-day hands-on training. So you're going to go through, our slideshow was 90 slides. So it took a couple of hours to get through just the slides. And then we went outside and actually did the cover, push, pull, pop on a couple of goats. And everybody has to demonstrate that they can do that and know and understand how to do that. These trainings are usually offered through extension. So if you're in another state, you can look at the wormx.info and see who the trainers are, because there are some people who do it privately, who have passed the test and do it privately. But you can get information through your county extension office usually, find out if there's going to be one offered anytime soon. Sheepandgoat.com is a good place for information, and then wormx.info is an extremely valuable place to get information, especially about parasites. And if you have any questions, you're always welcome to email me. I do check my email regularly, usually at least once a day, even if I'm off. So if you have questions, feel free to email me. And if you don't know who to contact in your area, I can usually figure out who the closest person to you is that you could contact for help locally.